In this video, you'll learn how to take this Quasar 2 app, Moneyballs, created in my Vue 3 and Quasar mobile and desktop apps course, and connect it to a Firebase Cloud Firestore database. By the end of this video, you'll have full CRUD capabilities set up for one user with load, add, edit, delete, and reorder. So I have the finished app from this video over on the right and the Firebase Cloud Firestore database on the left. And you can see we have one income entry for salary. And in the Firestore database, we have an entries collection with one document in it for this income entry. So if I add an expense entry now, so I'll add rent and set this to -999 and hit enter, we see this new document appear instantly on Firestore. And likewise, if I edit an entry, I'll change the name here to rent edited and hit enter. Again, we see that change appear on Firestore, or if I mark an entry as paid, we see that update on Firestore. And if I click on sort and reorder these entries, again, we see the order numbers update on Firestore. And if I reload the browser, these entries are still in the new order. And if I swipe left and delete an entry, we see that document deleted on Firestore. And you'll also get real-time data sync working across devices. So if I jump to the same app in Safari and add an entry, let's add added in Safari and enter an amount, we see that entry appear instantly on Chrome. This video is taken from my course, Quasar 2 and Firebase Cloud Firestore, available right now from makeappsacademy.com. In this course, we're going to take this Vue 3 and Quasar 2 app, Moneyballs, created in my course Vue 3 Create a Mobile and Desktop App with Quasar 2 and Pinia, and turn it into a full stack app by connecting it to a Firebase Cloud Firestore database. So right now on this Mac version, I'm currently logged in as Jim, and we can see his email address here on this logout button. And if I click that, we can see that we're going to add this auth screen where a user can register or log in. So the app is going to support multiple users. I'll just log in with a different user now called Steve. And we can now see all of Steve's entries. And we'll allow each user to add, edit, and delete their own set of entries. And we'll also add real-time data sync across devices. So you can see we're logged in as Steve on both Mac and iOS. And if I add a new entry here, Steve's adult diapers, we see that entry appear instantly on the iOS version. We'll also add security to the app with navigation guards and Firestore security rules. And we'll get this app working and built for production for iOS, Android, Mac, and Windows. For this course, I'd recommend that you've completed my course, Vue 3 Create a Mobile and Desktop App with Quasar 2 and Pinia. I'd recommend using a Mac and having a basic understanding of Vue 3, the Composition API, Quasar, Pinia, and JavaScript. In this course, I'm going to be using VS Code running on a Mac. And I'm going to be running all of my terminal commands within the ZSH terminal inside VS Code. And the relevant VS Code extensions I'm going to be using are auto rename tag, duplicate action, insert numbers, the make apps theme, which is the theme that you see here, the material icon theme, which gives us nice icons in our Explorer here, split HTML attributes, which allows us to quickly split all of our attributes and props onto a new line, Vue 3 support all-in-one, which gives us Vue syntax highlighting and all that stuff, and Vue extension box. And if you want to see the full list of VS Code extensions I'm using, go to dannys.link/VS Code setup. For most of this course, I'm going to be using Chrome with the Vue.js Devtools extension. This will allow us to debug all of our Vue and Pinia code. And to get this extension, click on the three dots here, go to Extensions, visit Chrome Web Store, search for Vue Devtools, and you can see the extension here. Make sure you get this one, which doesn't have the legacy or beta logo on it. And once you have that installed, we should be good to go to get started. Let's get the starter app for this course, Moneyballs, downloaded and running. First of all, download the zip from the link attached to this lecture. And you should have this zip file. So I'm going to extract that and I'm going to drag this folder into the folder where I store all of my projects, this projects folder, and I'll jump into that and I can see the folder here. And I'm just going to rename this to Quasar Moneyballs Firestore. And I'm going to drag this folder into VS Code. Then I'm going to open up the terminal and first of all, install the dependencies by running npm install. And that's now finished. So I'm now going to run Quasar dev to launch the app in the browser. And I can now see the app running in the browser. So let's just remind ourselves what this app does. So Moneyballs is a money management app, which allows us to add income and expense entries and keep track of the balance. So we can add an income entry by entering a name here at the bottom and entering an amount and hitting enter or clicking on the plus icon. And we can see that entry appear on the page. And we can see the current balance down at the bottom. And we can add an expense entry by entering a name and a negative number. You can see our income entries are in green and our expense entries are in red. And if we look at the balance, you can now see this rent entry has been deducted from the balance. We can also edit an entry by clicking in the name field and entering a new name. We can edit the amount by doing the same thing. We can reorder our entries by clicking on sort, dragging on these handles. We can mark an entry as paid by swiping right, and we see the styles change on that entry. We can also see the balance of all the paid entries down at the bottom. And we can swipe left on an entry and then click on delete in this dialog to delete an entry. And the app currently has two pages, this entries page and also this settings page with a bunch of different settings. Although these settings are not too relevant to this course, but we can disable the prompt to delete. We can show a running balance of all of our entries displayed underneath each entry. We can change the currency symbol and we can change the appearance to dark mode and see a completely different color scheme. But for now, I'm just going to set all of these options to the defaults and jump back to our entries page. So we're using a Pinia store to manage all of our entries data and all of the methods related to adding, updating and deleting entries. And this Pinia store is where we're going to be doing most of our work in this course. So let's just take a look at that file. I'm going to jump to the Explorer and go to source and stores and store entries.js. So all of the entries for our app are stored in this entries ref array here. And this is hooked up to the entries page to display all of the entries. And this entries array is just an array of objects with one object for each entry. And each entry has a unique ID, a name property, which is the name of the entry that you see on the left, an amount property, which is the amount that you see on the right, and a paid property to handle whether an entry is paid or not paid. And if I scroll down a bit, we currently have this watcher here, which is watching this entries ref for any changes, whether an entry was added, edited, or deleted. And whenever there is a change, we fire this save entries action. And if I jump down to that, this save entries action is currently saving the entries array into local storage, into an item called entries. And when the app first starts, this load entries action is triggered, which retrieves that entries array from local storage and then assigns that array to the entries array ref in our state, thus displaying the saved entries on the page. However, in this course, we're going to be removing all of this local storage functionality and instead saving all of the entries into a database instead. And I'll just briefly cover everything else which is in this Pinia store. So we have this options reactive object here, which just has this sort property. And this sort property is toggled when we click on this sort button here. And when this sort property is true, we can see these handles, which we can use to reorder our entries. And we also have some getters. So this balance getter is what is displaying this balance down at the bottom here. And it's basically just using the reduce method to add up all of the amounts in the entries array and calculate the balance. And this balance paid getter is displaying the paid balance down at the bottom, basically doing the same thing, but only adding up the amounts of entries which are marked as paid. Then we have this running balances getter, which is what is displaying the running balances if we enable this show running balance option on the settings page. And I'll just add another entry here so you can see what this is doing. So this is basically just a running balance of the entries as we go along. So in the beginning with this first entry, the running balance is the same as the value of that entry. Well, then we add this income entry, which adds 2,424. So this will then get added to the running balance so that we can see exactly what our balance is at this point. And this running balances getter is basically just generating an array of all of these running balances so that we can display them on the entries. And I'll jump down to the actions. So this add entry action is fired when we fill in this form at the bottom with a name and amount and click on add. And it's basically just creating a new entry object based on that form data, adding a unique ID property and a paid property and pushing it to the array of entries. Then we have this delete entry action, which is triggered when we delete an entry. We pass along the entry ID and it deletes the entry with that ID in our entries array. Then we have the update entry action, which is fired anytime we make some kind of update, such as editing the name or swiping to mark an entry as paid. And this action is basically just applying the updates that we made to the required entry in the entries array based on the entry ID. Then we have this sort end action, which is fired whenever we finish reordering our entries and let go. And this is basically just removing the entry that we moved from its old position in the entries array and then adding it back in at the new position so that our entries array is in the correct order. And we've already covered the save entries and load entries actions. And after that, we just have a couple of helpers, one which allows us to get the index of an entry based on its ID, and one method which allows us to fix a bug, which sometimes happens when we delete an entry, and that's explained here. Before we get started with Firebase, what is Firebase? Well, I'm just going to Google Firebase pricing and jump to the Firebase pricing page. So Firebase is an all-in-one backend solution provided by Google. It makes it really easy for us to add an out-of-the-box backend to our app without having to worry about complicated setup, scalability, and other issues. And we can hook this backend up using a really simple API. And in our case, we're going to be using the JavaScript API, although there's a bunch of different APIs for different platforms. So Firebase gives us authentication so that we can easily register and log in our users. It gives us two different real-time databases, the Cloud Firestore database and also the older real-time database. It gives us cloud functions so that we can execute code on the server side. It gives us cloud messaging at no extra cost. It gives us hosting so that we can host the web version of our app on Google's servers. And it gives us cloud storage so that we can use our app to upload images and stuff like that. Now, for larger projects, Firebase is not free, but everything we're going to do in this course can be done completely for free. Just don't share the finished app with thousands of people and you won't incur any charges. But if you want to learn more about Firebase pricing, then check out this pricing page at firebase.google.com/pricing. Let's create a Firebase project for our app for storing our users' entries. as well as displaying, adding, deleting, and updating those entries. Add authentication so that users can register and log into the app, and set up security rules for our database to protect our users' data. So to get started, jump over to firebase.google.com, and you will need to log into this website with a Google account. And if you're already logged into Chrome with a Google account, then you can just use that. But once you've created an account, just click on Go to Console, and you can see all of your Firebase projects here. So we're going to create a new project. So let's click on Create a Project. And for the name, I'm going to call this Moneyballs Firestore, and click on Continue. And I'm going to disable Google Analytics and click on Create Project. And the new Firebase project is now ready. So let's click on Continue. So to start using Firebase, we need to create an app by clicking one of these buttons here. And we're going to create a web app. So we're going to click on this web icon here. And for the app nickname, I'm going to use the same name I used before, Moneyballs Firestore, and click on Register App. So it tells us how to get started here. First of all, we need to install Firebase into our project with this command, npm install Firebase. So I'm going to copy that and jump over to VS Code, where I currently have the starter app running. And I'm going to press Ctrl+C to kill the dev process and run this command, npm install Firebase. And it's now installed Firebase. So I'm going to jump back to the Firebase page, and it gives us some initialization code that we can use to initialize Firebase in our app. All this is doing is importing this initialize app method from Firebase, setting up a config object with our particular project's API key and all that stuff, and then passing this config object into this initialize app method to initialize our app. So let's copy this code by clicking this button and jump back to VS Code. And I'm going to jump to the Explorer, and inside the source folder, I'm going to create a new folder called Firebase. And inside that folder, I'll create a file called firebase.js and paste in this code that we copied. And I'm going to tidy this up a bit. So I'm going to remove all of the comments, and I'm going to remove the semicolons because I'm not generally using them in this project. And I'm going to replace all of the double quotes with single quotes and save that. But before we can do anything with Firebase, we first need to set up a Firebase database. So let's jump back to the Firebase console website, scroll down to the bottom and click on Continue to the console. And now we need to create a Firestore database. So let's click on the menu, and we're going to go to Build and Firestore Database. Click on Create Database, and I'm just going to leave the default location and click on Next. And it's asking us what we want to do with our security rules. We can start in production mode and make our app secure by default. We can start in test mode so that anybody can read or write to our database. We will secure our database with some security rules later on. But right now, while we're getting started, it's going to be easier for us to start in test mode so that we can easily start writing to our database and reading from it. So I'm going to choose Start in Test Mode and click on Create. And our database is now created, and we can use this screen here to manage the data in our database. So I'm just going to move this over to the right. So a Cloud Firestore database is made up of collections, and each collection contains a series of documents. And in our app, we're going to have a collection called Entries, and within that collection, we're going to have a document for each entry. And you can also add sub-collections within documents, which is something we'll do later on. But for now, we're just going to click on Start Collection and create a collection called Entries and click on Next. And it's asking us to add a document to this collection. So let's add some dummy entries. So I'm going to jump back to VS Code, and I'm going to jump to Source, Stores, and Store Entries, and jump to the top. And I'm going to add a couple of dummy entries based on these entries objects that we have here commented out. So for the first document, I'll set the ID to ID1 like we can see here. So I'll put ID1 in here, and we'll also add this ID field, which is a string, and also set that to ID1. Then we'll add another field called name, like this one here. And this is also a string, and I'll set that to salary. Click on add field, and let's add this amount field. So amount, and this is going to be a number. So we're going to click on this type drop down and choose number, and I'll enter this number 4999.99. And finally, let's add another field, and we'll add this paid field, and this is a Boolean. So from this drop down, we'll choose Boolean and set this to true and click on save. So we can now see our entries collection over on the left with this one document in it with all of the fields that we added. So let's just add one more document to this collection. So I'll click on add document, and this time we'll set the document ID to ID2, and we'll add this ID field, which is also set to ID2. Click on add field, and we'll add a field called name, set to a string, and we'll set this to rent, and add another field for the amount field, set the type to number, and we'll set this to -999. Click on add field again, and add the paid field, set this to a Boolean, and set this to false, and click on save. So we now have a collection called entries with two documents for two different entries. So let's connect Moneyballs to this database so that we can display these entries on the page. Before we can access the data in this Cloud Firestore database, we need to connect our app to it. And if we click on this little help icon over on the right and click on Firebase Developer Docs, we can get to the Firebase documentation. So now let's go to Build and Firestore. And on the left here, let's click on Get Started. Let's scroll down. So we've already done this bit, create a Cloud Firestore database. So let's scroll down a little bit more to set up your development environment. And we're going to be using the Modular API. So let's click on this Web Modular API tab. So we've already installed Firebase to our project. And if we jump to the firebase.js file that we created, we're already importing this initialize app module, but we also need to import this get Firestore module from Firebase/Firestore. So let's copy this line and paste it underneath the other imports. And again, I'll replace the double quotes with single quotes. Let's scroll down a little bit more to initialize Cloud Firestore. So all we need to do to access our database is create a constant called db and set that equal to this get Firestore method and pass this app constant into it, which we already have set up here. So let's copy this line with the constant here and paste it at the bottom. And this db constant will now give us access to our database and allow us to read from it, write to it, etc. But in order to make this db constant available to the rest of our app, we need to export it. So let's add an export object at the bottom here and export this db constant. Let's save that. Let's jump back to our Pinia store, store entries.js in the source/stores folder. Let's import this db constant so that we can use it in this store. So let's import this. So we'll add import db from source/firebase/firebase and save that. And we can now use this db constant in our entry store to work with our Firestore database. In this module, we're going to display the entries that are in our Cloud Firestore database and also allow the user to add entries, delete entries, and update entries. But first of all, let's display these entries that we added to our database before in our app on the entries page. But first of all, let's launch our app. So I'm going to jump to the terminal and run Quasar dev. And we now see the app running in the browser. And in VS Code, let's jump to the Explorer and jump to our store file, source, stores, and store entries.js. Let's jump down to our actions. And we already have this load entries action here, which is fired when the app first starts and which is currently grabbing the entries which are stored in a local storage item called entries, and then assigning that array of saved entries to this entries ref in our state, thus displaying the entries on the page. However, we're not going to be using local storage anymore. So let's jump back down to that action and let's remove all of the code in this action and use this action to actually grab the entries from Firestore instead. So for now, I'll just log out, get entries from Firebase and save that. And if we jump to the app and show the console and reload, we can see this log being spit out, get entries from Firebase. Let's also remove any other uses of local storage. So let's delete this save entries action and we'll jump to the watcher at the top, which is firing that action. Let's get rid of this watcher as well. Let's scroll right to the top and we're no longer using watch. So let's remove that from this list of imports from Vue. Let's remove this import of the local storage plugin from Quasar and save that. And I'll just search for local storage. We're not using that anymore. Let's also delete any local storage that we might have stored in the browser. So if you click on these three arrows in Chrome and choose application and then local storage and then this item here with the URL we're using, we can see our local storage entries here. And we're also using local storage for the settings. We don't need to delete that, but let's delete this entries item here by hitting the delete key. Let's jump back to our store. Let's also move this load entries action to the top of our actions because I think that makes sense as this is the first thing that's going to happen in this store. So I'm going to cut this and paste it to the top of our actions here, paste that there. And I'll also jump down to the return statement and move this action to the top of the list here as well, so that everything is in the same order, and save that. So this load entries action is being triggered when our app first starts. And we can see this log being logged out in the console here. So in this action, let's grab all of the entries in our Firestore database in this collection called entries, and then add these to our entries array ref in our state so that we see these entries on the page. So let's jump back to the Firebase docs. Let's go to the menu and read data and get data. Let's jump down to get all documents in a collection. We need to import the collection and get docs modules from Firebase/Firestore. So let's copy this import line first and jump to the top of our store. Let's import these before we import our DB constant from our Firebase config file. And I'll just replace the double quotes with single quotes. Let's copy the rest of all this example here. So I'll copy that and jump down to the load entries action and paste that in. And again, I'll just remove the semicolons and replace all of the double quotes with single quotes. And I'll just stretch out VS Code a little bit. So this collection method here is going to grab a collection from our database. So it's going to grab the collection from the database specified here. And we're already importing our database as DB, so we can leave that as it is. And this second parameter will specify the name of the collection that we want to grab. And if we jump back to our database, we called our collection entries. So let's change this to entries instead of cities. And this getDocs method is going to grab all of the documents from this collection, which is being grabbed by the collection method, and put them into this query snapshot constant, which is an array of the documents. We then have a for each loop, which is looping through each document in that query snapshot. and logging out the document ID, this ID that we can see here, by using doc.id, and logging out the data of that document with doc.data parentheses. And since this getDocs method is asynchronous, we're using the await keyword here. So we need to make this load entries action asynchronous. And we can do that by just adding the async keyword here. So let's save this and reload our app and see what's being logged out. So I'll return to the app and reload it. And we can see it's logging out the ID of each document, this ID specified here. And it's also logging out the data of each document as well. And we can see all of the fields, the amount, the ID, the name, and the paid properties. So this data is already in a form that we can use straight away, because this is exactly how we're storing the data for each entry in this entries ref. So we just have an object for each entry with all of the different properties. And that's exactly what we're seeing logged out here. So let's jump back down to our load entries action. And we'll put this doc.data method into a variable called entry. So let entry equals doc.data parentheses. Let's log out this entry variable and save that. Reload. And again, we can see the data for each entry being logged out. So all we need to do now is push this entry variable into our entries array ref in our state in order to see these entries appear on the page. So let's remove this console log and we'll grab our entries array, and the value of this is our entries.value. And we'll just push this entry variable to this array and save that. And if we reload the page, we can now see these entries which are stored in our Firestore database being displayed in our app. One of the best features of Firebase is its real-time data capabilities, which means that if, for example, two people are logged into the app at the same time in the same account, and one person makes a change, such as adding an entry, then the other person will see that entry added instantly on their device. However, our app is not currently doing that, because if I drag the database over here and make a change to one of our documents, so I'll change the name rent to rent edited and click on update, we don't see that change appear on our page. Likewise, if I add a new document on here, so I'll add one with an ID of ID3, add the ID property and set that to ID3, and I'll set the name to phone and set the amount to a number of minus 14.99 and add the paid property and set that to a Boolean of false and click on save. Again, we're not seeing this new document appear on our page. We'll only see these changes when we reload the page. So if I reload the page, then we can now see the new phone entry and we can see the change that we made to the rent entry. So let's change our code so that we grab the entries data initially, like we are now, but so that we also listen out for changes and then update the view in real time. So let's jump back to the Firebase docs and we'll go to the menu and click on Get Real-Time Updates. And let's jump down to Listen to Multiple Documents in a Collection and scroll down a bit. This example is a bit more complicated than we need right now because it's also doing some querying, which we don't want to do right now. So I'm just going to copy everything from this on snapshot down to the end and copy that. And I'll move the database back over here, jump back to our store entries file, and let's comment out everything we've added so far to this load entries action and paste in this code that we copied. And again, let's remove the semicolons and replace the double quotes. So the getDocs method that we used before only fires once, but this onSnapshot method is a hook which will be fired every time the data changes. And we can replace this Q variable here with this collection method that we used before. So I'll copy that from this comment and paste it over this Q. variable. So this is going to do the same thing as before. It's going to grab the documents from the entries collection in our database, but it's also going to keep listening out for changes to that collection of documents. And everything else is working in the same way. This onSnapshot method returns a query snapshot again with an array of all the documents, and then it's looping through all of the documents in that query snapshot. So we can just copy the code that we added before from inside this for each and paste it into this one and uncomment that. And we can remove this cities array and this console log as well. So let's save this and see if it's working. I'll reload the app, and we forgot to import this onSnapshot method from Firebase. So I'm just going to jump back to the docs page. Yeah, it looks like we only need to import this onSnapshot module. So let's jump back to the top. We're no longer using this getDocs module, so let's paste over that with onSnapshot, save that, and reload the app. And again, we can see our entries on the page. But now if these documents get changed somewhere else, then we should see those changes reflected in our app. So let's jump back to the database, and I'll drag that over here, and I'll make a change to this phone document, and I'll change the name to phone edited and click on update. So we did see the new data being displayed, but we also see the old data still being displayed as well. So let's jump back to our load entries action. And this is happening because it's pushing an entry to the entries array every time a new query snapshot with an array of documents is received. So what we need to do instead is clear out the entries array whenever we receive a new snapshot before we add the new entries data to it. So instead of pushing each entry directly to the entries array, let's create a local array here and push the entries to that array, and then overwrite our entries ref array in our state with this local array. So let's create an array called entries FB and set that equal to an empty array. And then in this for each, we'll push each entry to this array. So we'll do entries FB.push. And then once this for each is complete, we'll set our entries array ref equal to this entries FB array here. So after the for each, we can do entries.value equals entries FB. So let's save that and see if it's working. Reload the page and jump to our Firestore database console. And let's change the name on this phone entry, change it back to phone. And we can see that was updated in real time. Let's see what happens if we delete a document. So I'll click on these three dots on this document, click on delete document and start delete. And again, we see that entry deleted from the page. Now, one thing to note is that this onSnapshot subscription will keep on running forever until we stop it. And it's fairly simple to do this. We can just assign this onSnapshot method to a variable or constant. So we could assign it to a variable called unsubscribe like this. And then later on, we could just fire a method on this constant to stop this snapshot from listening. So later on, we can just do unsubscribe parentheses to stop this onSnapshot listener from listening. And we are going to be doing this later on in the course, but not right now. So I'll just remove that and remove this unsubscribe constant. And another thing to note is that this code is currently replacing our entire entries array ref every time there's a change in our entries collection, regardless of the type of change, whether an entry was added, edited, or deleted. However, if we want to fire different code depending on the change that happened, whether an entry was added, updated, or deleted, then we can do that. So I'll just jump back to the Firebase docs and I'll scroll to the top and click on view changes between snapshots. So what we can do instead is fire this .changes method on the snapshot, which will return an array of changes. Then we can look at this change.type property to determine whether a document was added, modified, or removed. And then we can fire different code depending on the change that was made. So feel free to play around with that. But for this app, I'm just going to keep it nice and simple. So right now, when our entries are first loaded, it doesn't look too great. So if I reload the page, we briefly see our No Entries Yet widget appear, which we shouldn't really see at this point at all. And just to demonstrate how this would look with a slower internet connection, I'm going to jump to our Load Entries action and add a little delay before we assign these new entries to our entries array in the state. So I'm going to add a set timeout here with a delay of 1000 milliseconds and move this line where we're assigning the new entries to the entries array into that set timeout. So let's save that and reload the page again. So you can see this doesn't look very good at all. It would be better to show a loading spinner until the entries have been loaded from Firebase. So first of all, let's not display the entries or the No Entries Yet widget at all until the entries have been loaded from Firebase. So let's add a new ref to our state to manage this. So I'm going to jump up to our state properties, and underneath the entries array, I'll create a new constant called entries loaded, set that equal to a ref with an initial value of false. And we need to return this constant in our return statement so we can use it in our components. So let's scroll down to the return statement and add that here. Let's save that. So we want to hide our entries and the No Entries Yet widget whenever this entries loaded ref is set to false. So let's jump to the component which has these components on it. So I'll jump to the Explorer, and this is going to be in our pages folder, and it's this page entries.vue. And we can see the nothing here widget here inside a transition component to give it the little animation that it has. And we can see the queue list component here where all of our entries are displayed using this sortable component, which allows us to sort the entries. So let's collapse this queue list and collapse this transition component. And we'll place both of these inside a template. So I'll select those and drag them up into this template. Let's add a vif directive to this template. So v-if, and we're already importing our entries store here as this store entries constant. So we can just do vif store entries dot entries loaded and save that. And we now see our entries disappear. And if we reload, we don't see the No Entries Yet widget either. So now we just need to set this entries loaded ref to true once the entries are loaded. So let's jump back to storeentries.js and jump down to our load entries action. And let's remove this old code while we're here. So after we've assigned the new entries from Firebase to our entries array ref, we just want to set this entries loaded ref. So entries loaded dot value equal to true. Let's just make sure this is set to false when this load entries action is first fired. So at the top of this action, we'll do entries loaded dot value equals false. So let's save that and reload. And we now no longer see the No Entries widget appear, but we do still see a blank screen. So let's show some kind of loading indicator instead. So let's jump back to page entries.vue. So if store entries.entries loaded is true, then we display the No Entries Yet widget and the list of entries. Otherwise, we want to show something else. So let's add a div after this template. We can just add a v-else directive to this. We can show some sort of loading indicator here. So for now, I'll just put the text loading and save that, reload. So we see the text loading before we see our entries. But let's display a Quasar spinner component instead. So I'm going to jump to the Quasar docs at quasar.dev/docs. jump to the menu and view components and spinners, scroll down, and let's use this third one here. So let's click on view source and grab this third Q spinner component and paste it over this loading text and save that, reload. And the spinner's over on the left at the moment. So let's add a class to this div of text-center to place it in the center. And let's also add some padding with one of Quasar's padding classes. So we'll add Q-PA for padding in all directions. And we'll set this to XL for extra large. Save that, reload. And this is now looking a lot better. So currently when we add a new entry, enter a name, phone, and minus 14.99, this triggers an action in our entry store, this add entry action, and an object with the name and amount fields is passed to this action in this add entry form parameter. And we then create a new entry object by taking this object with the name and the amount that we're passing in, and also adding an ID property with a unique ID and a paid property set to false by default. And if no amount was passed in, we set this to 0 to make sure we have a number. And then we just push this new entry object to the array of entries in the state, thus seeing it on the page. But right now, this is only being added to the local entries array in our state. So if we reload the page, then we see that new entry disappear because it wasn't added to Firebase. So instead of pushing this new entry to our local entries array, let's actually add this entry as a new document in our entries collection on Firebase. And because we have our onSnapshot listener running all the time, that new document will be picked up by this listener, which will then update the local entries array with the new array of entries. And I've realized I've left this set timeout in, so let's get rid of that. We don't need that anymore. So let's jump to the Firebase docs, go to the menu, and we'll go to add and manage data and add data. Let's jump down to set a document. So one way we can add a document to our database is using this setDoc method. And this is going to add a document in the database specified here, in the collection specified here, and it's going to create a document with an ID, which is specified here in the third parameter. And then it's just going to pass in an object with all of the fields which we want to add to that document. So using this method will allow us to specify our own document IDs. And we are currently creating our own unique IDs using this UID method from Quasar. But if you want Firebase to generate its own IDs, then we can also do that by using this addDoc method. And we are going to switch to using this method later on. But for now, we're going to use this setDoc method. So I'm going to scroll back up to this setDoc example. So we need to import doc and setDoc from Firebase/Firestore. So let's copy this import, jump to the top of our entry store, and actually let's just copy doc and setDoc and paste those in here. And let's copy this example and jump down to the add entry action, which is here. Let's comment out the line where we push the new entry to the entries array, and instead paste in this setDoc method. And again, we're using await here, so we need to make this action asynchronous by adding the async keyword here. Let's replace the double quotes with single quotes. And again, we want to write to the entries collection, so we'll change this second parameter to entries. And we need to specify the document ID here in this third parameter. And that's going to be in this new entry object at newEntry.id. So let's set this to newEntry.id. And the object that we want to write to this new document is already set up in this new entry constant here. So we can just select this object with all of these fields and replace that with new entry and save that. Let's see if this is working. Let's jump to our app and reload. And let's add a new entry. So let's add phone minus 1599 and hit enter. And if we jump to our Firestore database, we can see this new document has been added with the ID generated by Quasar, and we can see all of the fields. And we also see the entry added to the page. And that's because we have this on snapshot listener, which is always running. So this detected that a new entry was added and sent down a new query snapshot with the new documents, which then got added to the entries array in our state, which is why we saw this new entry added. Now, it wasn't added in the right place. New entries should be added to the bottom of the list, and this was added to the top. But don't worry about that, because we're going to fix all of the ordering issues, as well as allowing the user to sort the entries properly in the next module. But for now, let's jump back to this add entry action and remove the line which we commented out. And we're currently using this database reference, DB and entries twice in our load entries action and in the add entry action. So let's place this collection into a constant which we can reuse. So I'm going to copy this collection method with the DB and entries parameters, and I'm going to jump to the top of this entry store, and let's create a constant here called entries collection ref. Set that equal to this collection method that we just copied. And then I'm going to copy the name of this constant, jump back down to the load entries action and select this collection method here and paste in this constant. Then I'm going to jump down to the add entry action, select DB and entries and paste in this constant name instead. So now whenever we need to access our entries, we can just use this entries collection ref instead of repeating it in every action, which means that if we need to change this collection ref later on, we only need to do it once. And we will need to change this later on when we get the app working with multiple users. So let's save this and make sure everything is still working. So we can display our entries. Let's add a new entry, butt plug, set that to 3455, and we can add entries as well. If we take a look at our entries documents in our Firestore database, we're currently duplicating these IDs. We have the ID once here for the overall document ID, and then we have it once again in this ID property within the document. Now we do need this ID property in our entries array in our Pinia store because we're using this ID for certain actions such as deleting an entry and updating an entry. However, we don't actually need to store this ID field in the Firestore database, because what we could do instead, if we jump to our load entries action, when we loop through the query snapshot of the documents, we actually have access to the overall document ID here at doc.id. So what we could do is add this ID to this entry object, entry.id, before we push each entry to this array of entries. And this way we can get rid of these ID fields on the Firestore database and reduce the overall size of our database, because these IDs are actually quite long. And also Firebase can create its own document IDs for us. So we might as well let Firebase do this for us so that we can reduce a little bit of the overhead in our app. So let's jump back to the Firestore documentation and we'll scroll down a little bit on this page to add a document and use the add doc method. So this method works in a similar way to the setDoc method which we used, except we don't need to provide a document ID because Firebase will generate that ID for us. So we're going to need this add doc module from Firestore. So let's jump up to our import statement, which is here, and add this add doc module. And let's copy this example here and jump back down to the add entry action, which is here. And let me just stretch VS Code out a little bit. And we'll comment out the setDoc method and paste in this example from Firebase. And we don't need to assign this method to a constant like this, unless we need immediate access to the ID, like you can see in the example here. But we don't need to do that, so I'm just going to get rid of this constant. And again, I'm going to replace DB and cities with our entries collection ref. And again, the object that we want to write to this new document is this new entry constant. So I'll replace this object again with new entry. And we no longer want to add this ID property. So I'm going to remove that and I'll scroll to the top. And we're no longer using the doc method or the setDoc method. So let's get rid of those. Let's save this and see what happens when we add a new entry. So I'll reload the page and I'll create an entry with the name added with add doc and give it a random amount. Hit enter. And we have an error here. Collection cannot be called on an empty path. So let's see where we've gone wrong here. The collection method is already in this collection ref. So we don't need this entries collection ref to be inside this collection method. So let's get rid of that and save that and try again. Reload. So added with add doc and give it an amount. So we can see the entry added to the page. Let's take a look at Firestore and find this document. So you can see Firebase has added this document and is created its own ID for this document. And we now no longer have an ID field in this document. Let's jump back to the browser and Vue Devtools and reload and Pinia. Let's take a look at the entry store and find this entry, which is here. So we don't have an ID property, but we are going to need that ID property because it's going to be used by actions such as delete entry and update entry. So what we can do is add this ID property to the entry when we grab all of the entries from Firebase in this load entries action. So we're looping through the snapshot of documents here. We're creating a variable called entry and adding the document data to this variable by using doc.data parentheses. And again, we can access the document ID at doc.id. So what we can do here is just set entry.id equal to this doc.id before we push it to this array of entries here. Let's save that, and we should now see an ID on this entry here added with add doc. So let's take a look at the object. We can now see the ID property for this entry. So we should be able to delete this now. And that seems to have been deleted. But we've now made our database a little bit tidier and made our app a little bit tidier as well. So let's delete all of these entries because some of them have the Quasar generated IDs. So let's just delete the collection and start again by adding some new entries. Let's just make sure we have IDs for all of our entries, and we do. Before we move on, let's just jump to this add entry action and remove this comment from before. Currently, if the user swipes left on an entry and clicks on delete, the ID of that entry is passed to this delete entry action, and we use this helper function to get the index of that entry in the entries array in our state. And then we use splice to remove that entry from the array in the state. So instead of doing this, let's delete the actual document with this entry ID from the entries collection on Firestore. So let's jump back to the Firestore docs and jump to the menu and delete data and delete documents. So this is nice and simple. We just need to use this doc method to select the document that we want to delete, specify the database, specify the collection, and then specify the ID of the document that we want to delete. And then we just pass that document method into this delete doc method to delete the document. So let's copy this doc and delete doc, these modules that we need to import. Let's add them to our list of imports from Firebase/Firestore. Let's copy this example and jump down to the delete entry action, which is here. Let's comment out these two lines and paste in this example. Because we're using await, we need to add the async keyword here. And we can replace the first two parameters of this doc method with our entries collection ref. And this next parameter is just the ID of the document we want to delete. And we're passing that into this action here. So we can just replace this with entry ID. Let's save this and see if it's working. I'll reload the page and get Firestore over on the right and refresh that. So let's delete this salary document that you can see here. So I'll swipe left on salary and click on delete. And we can see that document was deleted on Firestore and also removed from our page. So currently, if the user makes an edit to an entry, either by editing the name or editing the amount, or by swiping to mark an entry as paid, then the ID of the entry that was edited and the updates that need to be made are passed to this update entry action in our store. And I'll just log out this updates object so you can see what's going on, and save that and reload and clear the console. So if I change this name field on this rent entry, you can see that all we're doing is passing an object containing the name of the field we want to edit and the new value, along with the entry ID. Then we use the helper function to grab the index of the entry with that ID from our entries array in our state. And then we just use object assign to assign this updates object to the correct entry in the state, thus updating the entry in our state. But let's instead apply these updates directly to the document with this ID in our Firestore database. So let's jump back to the docs, and we'll jump to the menu and jump to add data and then update a document. So all we need to do is pass in a reference to the document with the database, the collection, and the ID of the document we want to update, and then just pass in an object with the changes that we want to make to that document. And one important thing to note is that only the fields which we pass into this object will be changed in that document, and all the other fields will be ignored and won't be changed. So we need to import this update doc method. So let's jump to the top and add that to our list of imports here, update doc. Let's copy this example and jump down to the update entry action. And I'll comment out everything we've got in that action and paste in this example. And again, we're using await, so we need to add the async keyword here. And we don't need to use this constant here. So I'm going to copy this doc method here and paste it over this Washington ref constant, and get rid of this constant and get rid of this comment as well. And again, we can replace the first two parameters here with the database and the collection with our entries collection ref. And we can just replace this ID with the ID we're passing into this action. So I'll replace this with entry ID. And we just need to pass in an object with the updates we want to make. And as we showed, the updates are in this updates object that we're passing into this update entry action. So we can just select this object and replace that with updates. I'll just get rid of that semicolon. Let's save this and see if it's working. Reload the app, and let's get the Firestore database open. Click on one of our documents. So this is this bills entry here. So if I edit the name, we can see it was edited on Firestore and also updated on the page. Let's try and change the amount. And that's working as well. And if we mark an entry as paid, This is also updated on Firestore as well. In this module, we're going to get our entries to order correctly, because right now when we add a new entry, it gets added to a random position instead of being added to the bottom. And also the sort functionality currently has no effect on Firebase, because after reordering these and refreshing, we see the entries back in the previous order. So first of all, let's make sure our entries are ordered correctly, so that when we add a new entry, it's added to the bottom. And there's no particular ordering built into Firebase by default. So we're going to need to add a new property or a new field to each of our entries to handle the ordering. So let's jump over to our entries store in source, stores, and store entries.js. And I'll jump up to the entries array. So what we could do is add a new property to each of our entries called something like order. So I'm just going to do a multiple selection in this comment here after each of these paid properties, add a comma and add 2 slashes. So we could add a property named order and set this to an integer to determine the order. And I'm just going to use this insert numbers extension to insert the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then we could add a new getter to order these entries by this order number before we display them on the page. So I'll just save that. And I'm going to delete all of these entries for now. And I'm going to add some entries named 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And I'm going to jump back to the Firestore console and add these order properties or these order fields manually. So this entry is named 1. So I'm going to add this order field, set that to a number and set it to 1. Jump to the next one. And this is 3. So I'll add the order field and again, set it to a number of 3. And I'll do the same for all the others. Okay, so now each of these entry documents have this order field with the numbers from 1 to 5. And if we reload our page here and jump to the Vue Devtools and Pinia and take a look at our entries array, we can see these order numbers here. So now let's create a getter which will order the entries by this order number. So let's jump back to VS Code and scroll down to our getters. And I'm just going to duplicate this balance getter and rename that to entries ordered and clear out the contents of this computed property. And I'm also going to return this getter at the bottom down here. So entries ordered and save that. And let's jump back to our new getter. So we can use JavaScript's sort function to do this. So what we can do is return our entries array, our entries.value. Then we can fire the sort function on that. And this sort function is going to compare each item in the array. And on each comparison, it's going to pass in one entry as this A placeholder and another entry as this B placeholder. And then we want to return something. And if we return a negative number, then the entry in the A placeholder will be placed before the entry in the B placeholder. So what we could do here is just return the order number of this A entry minus the order number of this B entry. So we can just return A.order minus B.order. Let's just save that and see if this getter is working in our DevTools. So if we go to Pinia in our Vue Devtools and down to getters, we can see our new entries ordered getter here. And the first entry has the order number 1, and the next entry has the order number 2, etc. So these entries are now in the right order. So now let's use this getter to display our entries on the page instead of hooking directly to the entries array. So let's jump to our entries page, which is in source, pages, page entries.vue. And you can see right now we're hooking directly into the entries array ref in our store. So I'm going to select all occurrences of store entries.entries by pressing Command Shift and L. And the shortcut might be different on Windows. And I'm going to replace these with store entries.entries ordered and save that. And I'll reload the page. And this isn't working because I've messed up this if directive here. And this if directive only shows this template with the nothing here widget and the list of entries if this entries loaded ref in our state is true. So let's just replace this store entries.entries ordered loaded with just store entries.entries loaded. Let's save that and reload. And now all of our entries are in the correct order. Let's see what happens if we add a new entry now. So I'll add an entry called 6 with an amount and hit enter. And you can see this wasn't added in the correct place. And if we look at the entry in the array, we can see it doesn't have this order property, which is currently ordering the entries. So we need to add this order property whenever we add a new entry. So I'm just going to delete this entry that we added just now. And I'm going to jump back to store entries.js and jump to the add entry action where we add a new entry. So when we add a new entry, we take the name and amount from this form down here and add this paid property to it. Let's also add the order property. Just to make this line a bit clearer, I'm just going to split some of it onto new lines like this. So we're adding this paid property to the new entry. Let's also add this order property, and we'll create a helper function to generate this order number. So let's trigger a function called generate order number. Let's create this helper function down in our helpers section here. And we're no longer using this get entry index by ID function, so we might as well get rid of that. So I'll add a new constant called generate order number, set that equal to an arrow function. And what we want to do here is return a new order number. So for example, if the highest order number in our array is 5, then the order number for the new entry needs to be 6. So we can use JavaScript's math.max method to work out the next order number. So for example, if we had an array of numbers, I'll create a constant called order numbers, set that equal to an array with 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And if we return the math.max function and pass in this array using the spread syntax like this, then this is going to compare all the numbers in this array and return the highest number, which is 5. But we also want to add 1 to this to make 6. So let's just add 1 as well. Let's just see if this is working. I'll save that and reload and add a new entry called 6. And it has placed the entry at the bottom. And if we look at the object for this entry, we can see it has added an order of 6. So this worked just now, but we did hard code this array of order numbers here. And we need to grab the actual order numbers from our entries in the entries array ref. And we can use JavaScript's map function to do this. So I'll just comment this out. And what we can do instead is again create a constant called order numbers, but we'll set this to entries.value and we'll fire the map function on this. And this is going to loop through each of the entries in our array. So we could use entry as the placeholder, and whatever we return in the callback will be added to an array. So we just want to return the order number, which is going to be at entry.order. And this will return an array of order numbers just like this, except it will be the actual order numbers from our array of entries. So let's delete these comments and save this and see if it's working. So I'll reload and create an entry called 7. And this should have an order number of 7. And it's been placed at the bottom. And if we look at this entry in the array, we can see it does have an order number of 7. And let's add another one. 8. And this one has an order number of 8. So this is currently working if we already have some entries, but let's see what happens if we start with no entries. So I'm going to jump to the Firebase console and delete this collection to make it a bit quicker to delete these. And let's add a new entry. And let's look at this entries ordered array. And we can see it's set the order to -infinity. And we want this to be set to 1. So let's jump back to the generate order number helper function. And what we can do here is check if there are some entries in the array, at least one. And if so, use this math.max function to generate the order number. But if there's 0 entries in the array, then we can just return the number 1. So what I'm going to do here is add another constant. So I'll add a comma here, and I'll just stretch this out a little bit. And we'll add a new constant called new order number. And if there are no entries in the array, then this map function will just return an empty array and set that empty array to this order numbers constant. So what we can do here is use a ternary if statement. So if order numbers dot length. So if there are some order numbers in this array, then we can return this math.max function. So I'll add a question mark and copy this math.max function and place that here. Otherwise, if there are no numbers in this order numbers array, colon, then we can just return the number 1. And then at the end here, we can just return this new order number. So I'll paste that in and save that. And let's see if this is working now. So I'll delete this entry with the infinity order number, add a new one. So I'll put 1 for the name. And let's have a look at the entries ordered array. And it does have an order number of 1. And let's make sure it's still working if we add multiple entries. Have a look at this new entry, and it does have an order number of 2. So if the user uses this sort functionality, let's say drags this 1 entry down to the middle, the entries are in the correct order locally in our state, but this has no effect on Firebase, because if we reload, then all of the entries are back in the original order. So what we need to do is when the user finishes sorting and lets go, we need to update all of these order numbers on Firebase to reflect the new order. So first of all, let's display all of the order numbers next to each entry to make it a bit easier to see what's going on with these order numbers. So I'm going to jump back to VS Code, and the component for an individual entry is in source, components, and entries, and entry.view. Let's scroll down a bit. So here's where we're displaying the entry name that you can see on the left. So let's also display parentheses, and then inside that double curly braces, and we'll display the order number with entry.order and save that. And we can now see all of the order number values on the page. So after the user clicks on sort and drags an entry and lets go, then we have an action in our entry store called sort end, which is fired at that point. And this code here is going to take the entry that we moved, remove it from the array from the old position, and put it back into the array at the new position. So at this point here, our local entries array is in the correct order. So what we could do at this point is loop through all of the entries in the array, replacing all of the order numbers with 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So once our local array is in the correct order, let's fire a new action named update entry order numbers. Let's create this method after the update entry action. So I'll add a new constant named update entry order numbers, set that equal to an arrow function. So what we could do here is set up a variable called current order, set that equal to 1, and then we can loop through all of the entries in our array, which at this point will be in the correct order. So we know that the entry in the first position needs to have the order set to 1, and the entry at the second position needs to have the order number of 2, etc. So let's jump back down to this update entry order numbers function. Let's loop through our entries with a for each. So we can do entries.value.forEach, and we'll use entry as the placeholder and add the arrow function. And we can set the order property on that entry. So entry.order equals, and we'll set that to this current order variable. So on the first iteration of this for each, it's going to grab the first entry in the array and set the order property to this current order variable, which is set to 1. But then on the second iteration, we want to set this order number to 2. So we need to increase this current order variable by 1 on each iteration of this for each. So we can just do current order plus plus to increase this by 1. So let's save this and see if this is working locally. I'll save this and reload. So right now our order numbers are 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So let's see what happens when we reorder and let go. And you can see it has updated all of the order numbers from 1 to 5. However, we still need to update all of the entries on Firebase with these new order numbers. So after this first for each, let's add another for each, which will loop through the entries which now have the correct order numbers. And again, I'll use entry as the placeholder. And this time we want to update the entry document on Firebase with the new order number. And we can use this update entry action for this. So we can just do update entry, pass in the entry ID, which is going to be at entry.id. Then we need to pass in an object with our updates. And we only want to update the order property. So we can pass in the order property from this entry with entry.order. Let's save that and see if this is working. So I'll reload the page and I'll drag this first entry to the middle. Let's jump back to the Firestore console. And it looks like it has updated these order numbers. So this one with the name 2 has the order number 1. This one with the name 4 has the order number 4, etc. So let's reload the page and make sure these are still in the correct order. Yeah, so this is working now. We're now updating these order numbers on Firebase so that whenever the user reorders, their entries will be in the right order. Before we move on, let's remove these order numbers which we added to our entry component. So I'll jump to entry.view and remove these order numbers and save that. Get the rest of this course, modules 5 to 11, right now from makeappsacademy.com, where in module 5, you'll add an auth page to the app where a user can register and log in. In module 6, you'll add authentication to Moneyballs so that users can register, log in, and log out. In module 7, you'll restructure the Firestore database to handle multiple users and get the app working correctly for multiple users. In module 8, you'll add navigation guards to the app to prevent a logged out user from getting to the entries page and prevent a logged in user from getting to the auth page. In module 9, you'll add Firebase security rules to the database to protect your users' data. In module 10, you'll get the app built for production and working for web, iOS, Android, Mac, and Windows. And in the bonus module, module 11, you'll move the entry ordering logic out of the front end and into the back end by using a Firestore query. Go to makeappsacademy.com where you can get the rest of this course right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.